Hi, I'm Len Epp from LeanPub, and in this episode of the Front Matter podcast, I'll be interviewing Nicola Lindgren. Based in Malmö, Nicola is a senior quality assessment engineer and manager, as well as an international conference speaker and blogger with a focus on subjects like software testing, leadership, and agile. You can follow her on Twitter at Nicola Lindgren and check out her website at nicolalindgren.com. Nicola is the author of the LeanPub book, Starting Your Software Testing Career. In the book, Nicola provides readers with a guide to finding their first role as a software tester and practical suggestions for how you can hit the ground running in your new career after you've been hired. In this interview, we're going to talk about Nicola's background and career, professional interests, her book, and at the end, we'll talk a little bit about her experience writing and self-publishing. So thank you very much, Nicola, for being on the Front Matter podcast.
Thank you for having me.
I always like to start these interviews by asking people for their origin story. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about where you grew up and how you found your way into a career in software testing.
Alrighty. I am from Auckland, New Zealand. I think New Zealanders would know this, but I'm a Jaffa, just another fucking Aucklander. In terms of how I got into testing, it wasn't actually the plan. My plan was to become a diplomat, but the year that I had graduated, they laid off like 20% of their staff. For some reason, they weren't hiring, so they were laying off 20% of the staff. So then I had to figure out, okay, what next? There was a test consultancy in New Zealand that had a grad program, so I did it. I guess, I don't know. To be honest, I didn't know about other roles in IT except for developer. And I think in the job ad or something, they were like, are you curious? Are you interested in technology? Some sort of stuff like that. And I could relate to what they were saying. So here I am, I don't know, almost 10 years later. Moved to Sweden for work, and yeah.
Yeah, no, thanks very much for sharing that. That's interesting. Going from a career and potentially, diplomacy to sort of software testing is really interesting move. And if you don't mind, how did you find your way to Sweden? Did you get hired before you moved, or did you move there and then get a job? Okay.
Yes, I met my company at a conference. So yeah, it felt right. Actually, the funny thing is, I initially applied for my previous company. I initially applied for one of their roles in Switzerland because I speak German. But the managing director of the Swiss branch said, since you're not an EU citizen, that's not really a viable option for you. How about Sweden? So it's weird because people are like, oh, you must love Sweden. You know, like I'm on subreddits like Till Sverige or To Sweden, and people are like, oh, I love Sweden so much. And I don't know, it kind of just happened. I also happened to meet a guy around the same time when I was moving here. So I was very fortunate to get a work permit and have that sort of security. But at the same time, someone wanted to explain aspects of Swedish bureaucracy to me.
Oh, that's really interesting. So, I've moved around a bit, and a lot of the people who we have on the podcast have moved around a bit. And so, you're saying that being from New Zealand, it was actually easier for you to move to Sweden than to an EU country.
I'm not 100% sure if Switzerland's the EU. I think they might be in like the European Economic Area, also just sort of terms. They're still in the Schengen area. It's just, I guess different countries have different requirements around work permits. So I don't necessarily think it was because I was a New Zealander. I think it was just pretty tough for a non-EU citizen to get to Switzerland, or at least that was my impression.
And how was your first winter?
To be honest, the cold's not so bad because you can always wear more clothes, right? Like, more layers. It's the short days. I remember I was working from home a little bit for my first project, and at like 3 o'clock be pitch black. Because we're in Stockholm, by the way, for the first year, so the days are shorter there in winter compared to Malmö. And I remember, like, I never really like checked the time. I would start to like pack down my laptop and think, oh, the day's over, and then I like check the clock, like, oh, it's only like 3 o'clock. I probably should still work. I haven't done my hours. So that was probably the most shocking thing. And then just walking on snow. Like they do put salt. I mean, they do put salt in the ground, but I'm not from a city that has snow, so I'd be often late because I just walked so slow. I'm very clumsy. So that was, first world problems. That was tough for me.
Yeah, it's thanks very much for sharing that. I partly ask because I come from a place called Saskatchewan in Canada, where it's very cold in winter, and the days are quite short, but nothing like up in Stockholm, which is a few degrees latitude even north of that. And yeah, it is interesting. I mean, the people do often, of course, the sort of natural things to think about the cold, but the short days really do get to you. Particularly, I just remember, it being sort of like pitch black until like 10 in the morning or something like that, and that's just really kind of like messes with your sort of natural expectations. Even I mean, I say that as someone who grew up in that environment, it still seems strange sometimes.
A vitamin D pills also a thing where you live, because it's a thing here, but I never really got into that.
Yeah, no, they weren't. I mean, people's attitude towards the cold, at least where I grew up, at the time I grew up, was very reckless. It was kind of like people wouldn't even wear toques sometimes. It's just kind of rush out to the car and rush into whatever building you're going to. I think it's a lot different now. And so so that's so interesting. So you got some training in software testing, and then you got your first job when you were still in New Zealand. What was your first job like? What did you do? Did you get like a long list of like test this, test that, test this, test that, and sit in the cubicle?
Yeah. My first job was at a consultancy for a government project. And the thing is, when you're junior, is you don't really, I didn't really have much say as to how things would go. I kind of just listened and did what I was told. And to be honest, I didn't really have the confidence back then to question things. So it was a matter of writing test cases in a spreadsheet and then uploading it to the test case management tool. And then a business analyst or someone from the business would change their mind about a bunch of stuff, and you have to update a bunch of shit. And it was. I don't really miss that environment, but like I am grateful for the opportunity. I mean, I think a lot of people, when they want to like switch careers, it can be hard to do. So I'm grateful for that. And I made some good friends on the project. So, that's the silver lining in that cloud.
Yeah, it's actually it's sort of funny when you're so familiar with these kinds of things. It's kind of hard to know where to start talking about them from the perspective of someone who's unfamiliar with it. And I've already kind of jumped over that. So maybe just taking a step back, if you could talk a little bit. I know at the beginning of your book you actually have you provide a definition from someone about what software testing is, but if you could just talk a little bit about what software testing is and maybe why it's actually so important.
All right. Put simply, I don't think that this is necessarily the definition verbatim in my book. Software testing is getting information and then communicating that information about the software under test. Was there a part two to the question? I'm sorry, I forgot the part.
Oh, no, that's okay. That's okay.
Right.
I put two things in one. I put two things in one question. And then the second thing is like, why is it actually like it sounds sort of when one sort of defines it or describes it, it can sound very kind of simple, but like it's incredibly important software testing. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about why it's so important.
There's the weird thing, and I go over this in the book a bit, is that something like the purpose of software testing is different to different people, and this often depends on the project. So that I just shared with you my definition or my understanding, and that's largely based on my experiences and more senior people that I've worked with whose opinions I respect. And another very common definition of software testing is to find bugs. But like, if you don't find any bugs, then would you say you have not achieved your goal? And it's weird because some people may think, oh, how can you not find bugs? But I've worked with some very good developers, right? I remember some people were like, oh, we should test against the requirements and then limit it to that, or some sort of written documentation, for example, user stories as well. But then, did you know that developers can also read? So why would they code bugs into it when they can obviously read that this is what this field should do. This is what the permissions of this user should be. So it's not really enough I like to use an analogy when it comes to software testing, and that is interviews. So with software testing, you're trying to uncover information about the software under test, and then your hope is to get some sort of depiction of reality, or you hope to. You don't want some sort of like surprise motherfucker when you go live. With interviews, I think companies and the candidates are trying to do the same thing. They're trying to suss each other out. So based on the questions that the interview asks, and then the questions that the candidate asks at the end or throughout, then they're trying to picture what it may like to be what it may be like to work there, or the candidate is, or the company trying to figure out, okay, is this company trying to pull one over me? People aren't always honest at interviews, unfortunately. So if you ask the questions and you listen to the answers, and then based on the answers, you then ask another follow-up question, and then as time passes, your mental model or your understanding of what the other side is changing. So I quite like analogies, and that's probably one of my favorite ones.
I've got to say, I'm a big fan of analogies, and I've interviewed a few myself, and I've interviewed a few people in software testing for this podcast, and that's the first time I've heard the interview analogy. I've heard martial arts, I've heard crime scene investigation, and things like that. And the interview, that is really fascinating because it's so two-way, which is really compelling, right? Because I think you mentioned sort of like for some companies, software testing is finding bugs, right? And this is the idea that for people who aren't familiar with the way these kinds of things work, it's like if you've got a product, let's say it's an app or something like that, that's supposed to do something that people are supposed to sign up for and download to their phone or something like that. You sometimes have companies that are just like really straightforwardly bottom line focused, I might say, and so they kind of like have some computer people who do the computer stuff, and then they've made their product, and then they just want someone to test it to make sure nothing breaks. And that's one form of software testing is just make sure it works. And then, but there are other, but the more in that, if you're dealing with, say, a very simple app, that actually might even be all you kind of really need to do to some extent. But when you start getting like into way more sophisticated products or services and things like that, there's much more of a kind of, where there's no kind of idea of anything really being finished. The idea of it being a back and forth between the tester and the product, or the tester and the developers, and something like that, much like an interview, is really interesting. And I really like that you brought up people aren't always honest. Unfortunately, but I mean, in the context, I'm talking too much, but in the context of software testing, and in so many other things that we do, we kind of hope we know we might have used a shortcut over here in what we did, and we might not necessarily be all that forthcoming.
And I think whether or not you said how you might always be that forthcoming, I mean, that would also depend. I mean, if you're talking from the perspective of a developer, that also depends on the relationship between the tester and the developer, and then how safe people feel to admit their mistakes. I mean, if you feel safe to be like, oh, I fucked up, then chances are people are going to be forthcoming. But if you've seen other people get blamed and called out in public, I have worked in environments earlier on in my career where people were shouting, not at me, thankfully. It was, I could imagine why people wouldn't be so forthcoming in such context.
Yeah, it's really interesting how people think that often people think that when you're dealing with kind of technical stuff, people are themselves kind of become technical, but they usually remain people, and their emotions can get involved, their pride can get involved, their fear for their job or their frustrated ambitions can get involved, and sometimes people really do blame other people for their mistakes.
Unfortunately, I've seen that happen as well.
I've got it's interesting too. So because they're so from what I gather, the role of the software tester, as you've already mentioned, can differ from project to project or company to company, and sometimes you can actually find yourself in the situation where you're the only tester on the project, or maybe even at the company if it's small. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about what to do if you find yourself in that situation where, let's say, it's like 10 developers and just you as the tester.
Um, Firstly, if this is like someone's first role or one of their first roles if they're a junior, I would highly recommend them to get involved in the testing community. Go to meetups, conferences if they can get budget approval. The reason for this is that they're not being exposed to other ideas. So their understanding of how testing is done could be limited to that project. If someone is further along in their career, I would still urge them to do that. But then at that point, if they've been on other projects or at other companies, they would presumably already have an understanding of how testing can also be done. So then I think it's good to network, to bounce ideas, to just get some sort of inspiration. You can also, like I have been on projects where the developers would like help me test or bounce ideas. So the disadvantage of not having another tester to speak to in terms of what do you think and like of this approach, developers I find are often also happy to listen and then to make suggestions. So you may ask, what is anything in particular I should focus on? Like, do you have any concerns? And it's not that you will only focus on what they said, but you would then make sure to not forget the areas that they suggested you focus on.
And as a software tester, so is it typical for the tester to actually see the code or to ask a very basic question, or do you often just see the kind of like user interface that someone's going to be interacting with and just kind of break it? Sorry for such a crude question, but
no, honestly, I couldn't. I have no idea in terms of what's typical, like percentage if it's like over 50%. I have worked with testers who get quite into the code, so they'll look at the pull request and see what the changes were, what files are changed. I've also worked with testers who only look at the UI and don't even look at like the Chrome Dev tool. Personally, I think is an added advantage of being able to read code and understand what it does. So I would urge people to start looking there and ask for access. And some projects, when I didn't initially get access, when I finally gained the confidence, I would ask, can I have a look at the repos? It'd be nice to see like the pull requests for these changes that you'd like to test, so I can have a better understanding of what you actually did to make this happen.
Speaking of getting involved in the community, as you recommended for people who are getting into testing, if they're looking to get into their first role or they're already in their first role, you've founded a couple of meetups yourself. I think one in New Zealand and one in Sweden. In your experience, when someone sort of arrives for the first time at their first meetup, what's the question people is there a question that people typically sort of ask first that often comes up?
Quite common to ask about roles. A lot of people do go to meetups with the intention of networking and landing a role. And then, people can be quite shy, especially when you are going to a meetup and you're not going with your colleagues. So they may just like small talk, and I would try to introduce people to each other because I understand it could be intimidating approaching someone, but if someone who's an organizer who I don't know how you describe it, like I would say it's part of the role to like make people feel comfortable and get the most out of it. Sometimes people would ask to give talks. So they'd say, I've got this topic in mind. Are you looking to have a meetup, in the next few months? I'd love to talk about security testing or exploratory testing or mobile test automation. And then you have a conversation about that.
And is it, do talks at meetups, do they often take the form of kind of case studies where people sort of tell a story about a really tricky bug that they discovered, or?
Often, I would say people tend to go for stories. There are probably meetups where they do focus on case studies, but the one that I co-founded in Auckland, as well as the one I founded in Stockholm, the format is like a specific term, but it's like this thing where you share an experience report. So for 20 minutes, you talk about like what you've learned or how you approach a certain problem at work. And then you have something called open season, where people would, it's facilitated discussion. So people would ask the speaker questions, and then people would ask each other questions, and then it's a facilitator's role to like make sure people don't dominate. So you hold up color cards as to whether or not you would like to add to the current thread of discussion, or whether or not you'd like to start a new topic, or if you feel like you're going around in circles, so it's a different colored card that you hold up, and if enough people do that, you're like, let's just move on. So that's quite good, and I think a really good thing about experience report is that it encourages people who don't think that they're experts to share their ideas or knowledge, because they're not like, oh, I know so much. They're just saying, this is what I learned. This is how I've done this, right? And if you phrase things like that, like what, like is someone going to attack you? No, they'll say, oh, what did you think of? Have you ever thought about this of this tool? Or you know, that, and I just want to say that people like hearing stories. So even I really enjoy just hearing how other people do things, whether or not I would have the opportunity to apply what they talked about as another question. But it's really cool hearing how people approach or tackle different problems.
Yeah, it's yeah. Thanks very much for sharing that. It's so interesting. The challenge of software testing is it's so unique. I guess I would say I'm just thinking of speaking of specific stories. I've done some nothing more really than sort of ad hoc testing for LeanPub, and but I find it sort of an interesting challenge. For example, one time when I was doing some internationalization, I had this problem with Norway, and it was because the country code no actually was a command in Rails. No. And it took a while to figure out, like, it's just so weird. It's like everything's right in the code, but nothing's working. What's going on? And then there was something I had to figure out about basically the language or the setup to sort of like, figure out what was going on. Those kind of the categories of what strings of characters mean can become kind of a part of what you're looking into. Do you have any sort of one or two stories that come to mind for kind of really interesting bugs that you found?
I don't know about embarrassing is probably the best. In my first project, there's actually two stories. Firstly, on my first project, I made a test on Internet Explorer. I didn't really know about Chrome DevTools. You can't use Chrome DevTools in Internet Explorer anyway. So we would create profiles. So you'd fill out the form, choose like the type of profile you're creating, and then click submit, and a confirmation screen would appear. And the weird thing is, sometimes the profiles would be created, sometimes not. Back then, I didn't know how to look at network requests or look behind the scenes to make sure that the UI is telling the truth. This idea, and this is why I think people should read code or at least be able to look behind the scenes. I trusted the UI. I thought that the UI is truthful. I remember I was following test cases, but you're not necessarily, or in that environment, you weren't necessarily writing every single detail of every single field that you filled in. So I remember thinking, did I just imagine creating that profile? Like, I've done that sort of thing at home, intend to do something and not do it. But it turns out there was actually an issue. The second story would be, I was doing an inventory count feature, so I was the only tester in the team. I did peer testing. I got my approach reviewed about what I planned to cover, but we couldn't cope with the number of products. So I think I tested up to like 100 or something like that. But then retailers would have thousands upon thousands of SKUs. So it would just crash. And this was just before stock take season, so we had to stay up late. So the good thing I just want to say about making mistakes is that you remember those lessons. Like, I don't remember like I mean, I do remember a few, but like you're not really going to remember all the things you did well on different projects, right? Like it's just like a normal day at some surveying. But when you fucked up, you're gonna like make sure that that sort of mistake or something similar that triggers that sort of ideas, those sorts of things won't happen again.
This is a very specific question about your career, but have you done video game testing? I think I saw a reference to that somewhere, maybe in your LinkedIn profile.
Yeah. Yes. I was on a project for like 3-4 months. I actually don't know if I'm allowed to say which project, but it's done. We no longer doing it. I'm going to earn this at a caution. Yes. So there was a QA already on the project, and I was there to support and like help like mentor them and have them bounce ideas off me, and then set up test automation. So this was a game built in Unity. I hadn't worked with video games before, and I didn't quite realize that they were a bitch to test because you can't really detect, like normally you can't really detect elements in screens, so you can't like tap on buttons or whatever, which I normally, at least for UI testing, which I would normally be able to do in other contexts. But there's a test framework or a tool called an alt Unity tester. So when I discovered that, I just had to set it up and cover the regression that way.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I think I remember speaking to someone once, saying, "Oh, Mountain, that must be so exciting doing video game testing." And he's like, "Man, my latest one was a racing game, and my job was just to turn the wheel to the right and scrape up against the wall for like 3 hours straight to see if it broke it." But I guess one of the reasons I like to think about video game testing is that you can see these kind of, it's really visual examples of it, like with I don't know if you know about speed runs and stuff like that in video games. So
people just try to finish a whole game from start to end, and they're just trying to go super fast.
Yeah, it's trying to do it super fast, but I mean, there's the kind of like playing it by the rules, but it doesn't take too long before people try and figure out how to break the game to get things done faster. And so if you go to, I forget what the actual URL is or the web address is, but like, there's Speedrun is this website. And if you look up sort of Speedrun for Zelda Breath of the Wild, for example, the latest, like they found a way to kind of like people who were doing it sort of thought about how must the physics be working about when I pull out my shield and try and surf on it on the hill. And they figured out that like, if you try and like, I don't know, it's something like if you try to like shoot your arrow while you're trying to surf on the shield at just the right moment, you can jump way up into the sky because it tricks the game mechanic into thinking that it needs to move you this far or something like that. Instead of down the hill, it's up into the sky, something like that. The latest version, a guy can use a kind of get a hold of a branch and fly with it. And again, the reason I bring that up is because if you think people are like spending all day long trying to break video games, they're just think about payment systems and banks and stuff like that.
I mean, they're trying to exploit it. Yeah.
Yeah. And it won't be visual in the same way. And like, using a joystick or something like that, but people are always trying to break things like that. Have you ever worked on projects like that, like with banks or insurance systems or anything like that?
I worked with payments. So the customer of the client were banks. So they handled FPOS. Is FPOS is that a term that you're familiar with? I'm not sure if it's a New Zealand thing or not.
What's the term?
FPOS.
How do you spell that?
EFTPOS. So it's like card transactions or debit card transactions.
Okay.
So they handled like 75% of these type of transactions, and New Zealand is pretty digital. So they were doing an upgrade because the current system was no longer going to be supported. And they would work, I mean, I found out this is like normal. They have very old systems, or at least they did back in like 2013. So it's like you have this blue screen and you just like only use your keyboard and like type shit to test it. I barely can remember. And then we were told the importance of it because, when it comes to money, if people can find ways to exploit it, they will try. They definitely will try.
Yeah, I'm just looking it up here. I'll put a link to the post payment processing system in the transcript for this interview. But I guess it is something that I should have heard about before. But yeah, that's
No,
so
no,
that's so you know
I
that's
get mixed up. Sorry.
no, that's okay. It is interesting how serious it can be. That when you're testing, you're kind of like trying to figure out what the bad guys are going to try and do yourself. You're not just looking for bugs, but looking for ways to exploit.
Yeah.
Yeah. Um, just moving on to the book specifically, starting your software testing career. What was the inspiration for this book? What moment did you find yourself thinking, "Oh, I'm gonna write a book"?
Um, Last November, so November 2020, I think I come across some developer books where they say, how to become a developer. And it's a few of those, right? There's actually a decent number of those. And I was like, none exist for testing. So I started writing the book on Google Docs on my phone. Because I thought to myself, like, I wasn't like committed to writing a book. I was thinking to myself, this might be a series of blog posts. And I wanted to have this like one-stop shop for people who are starting their career and how to go about finding a role, like how you can do testing, good things to keep in mind, different contexts. I remember also making sure that I wanted to interview other people because I know for a fact I don't know everything about what I wanted to talk about. There were certain areas that I thought would be beneficial for the reader. So, for example, I've got a story on someone being a sponsor. I have been sponsored, but I don't think I have sponsored someone. Also, recruiting. I have some experience reviewing CVs and interviewing candidates, but I know people who have a lot more experience than me. So I'd approach them and ask, what do you think? I also interview developers, so, and product analysts or business analysts, so they can get that perspective. So I tried to it's more a research project than anything. When I had the outline written, and I was like, okay, this is going to be a book. I thought, okay, let's do it on Leanpub. I didn't announce it straight away because I still wasn't sure that it would go live. I mean, I could have just written a book in Leanpub and then copy pasted it and made it some blog posts. But I think it'd be nice to just have one hopefully useful resource for people either starting out their careers or early on. I feel also that it is beneficial for people who are a bit more senior, so like intermediate, but that's not really my target audience. When I was writing the book, my thoughts were what will benefit people new in testing, and then it's just like a side effect if it happens to benefit others. Just so it's easier to give my book focus, or at least for me, than try and make everyone happy.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I mean, that's a very good point. That there are tons of books out there for get started in your career as a developer, a software developer, software engineer, or programmer, and stuff like that. But yeah, for software testing, there just isn't the same kind of volume of guides out there. And of course, for a lot of people, when you're just there's when you've sort of made it to some extent in a career and you're a few years in or a decade in or something like that. I mean, one of the things I think everybody thinks about is, man, I really wish I'd known A, B, and C when I was starting out. And so when people take the time, away from their work to kind of actually communicate that to people, it can be kind of life-changing for people, right? To kind of this, to actually know that from the beginning. Is there one or two things that you can think about that sort of really come to the top of your mind when you think about, I really wish I'd known this when I was maybe not your first job, but when I was in my first year or something like that?
I think knowing your self-worth. So I think a mentor is good for that. They have a broader perspective of what the testing industry is like. If you are in your first project or in your first year, You might not realize what you have to offer. So I think having someone who can, at least for me, when I had a mentor from about 9 months after I started, or a year, maybe two, it was really nice having someone to, like when I became unhappy in my role, and I was like, well, what's the point in applying for roles? Like who else would have me? So it was nice to have a mentor in that regard. I'm trying to think of something else. I think knowing how to, like, I don't know if it's a controversial opinion for a lot of testers, but like learning how to write test automation. I put it on a pedestal. So I started learning it at about after 3 years or 2 years. And I remember like, oh my God, it's so hard. And I'm not saying it's easy, but I really hyped it up to be more than it is. The reason I think it would have been useful to learn earlier on is that if you know how to do it and you understand the benefits of test automation, then you know when to apply it, right? If you don't know anything about test automation, then you'll never have the option. So it's not necessarily a case of just because you can, you should, but more, oh, okay, you're on a new project, or you're on a new project. Would this project be better from test automation? And then, more importantly, these days, it seems to be a very popular skill, or in-demand skill. The problem with I want to say manual testing, but some people don't like that term. The problem with that is that there's this massive misconception of that anyone can do it. And technically anyone can do it. Can they do it well? No, that's another question. So if you're looking for a role and you can't look at the code, you're doing something that people believe can be done by anyone in the team, or like anyone off the street. Why would they hire you? Like what? In my opinion, it's like, what do you have to offer? Some people can get roles with only manual testing experience. But like when I'm on LinkedIn and I have a wee nosy, I notice that that's becoming more and more in demand. So it's like for job security, I do feel that it's good to learn. So in my book, I talk a bit about like what to learn, because it's like, oh, I should learn test automation, right? But there's a bunch of frameworks, there's a bunch of languages. So I suggest 3 different frameworks to get you started. So you don't have analysis paralysis, because I've worked with people I've come across people who are like, I want to get into IT, I want to get into testing, and they just like talk, right? They don't do anything. So it's the idea of like simplifying the decision, or at least narrowing down the options. So that's what I wish I got into sooner, or at least kind of like took off a pedestal.
Yeah, and when it comes to walking the walk instead of just talking the talk, when you're sort of looking to switch into a career into software testing, is that in addition to going to meetups and stuff like that, does that include things like taking courses so you can put that on your LinkedIn profile or your CV and stuff like that, and show that you've taken the initiative? Like you've never had a job in software testing and done test automation, but you've taken this course.
Yes. So one of the people I interviewed, Gabby Trotter, she's a recruiter, and she said how appealing that is because someone's actually done something about it, and they show that they're passionate about starting their careers. Another thing would be horizontal shifts. I interviewed someone who has not, I won't say hired people, but people joined their test team through a horizontal shift. So they were in the support team. And I've actually been on a few projects where it's like that. Because the thing is, if you're already in a company that has software testers, if you're at the company, let's just assume that they trust you, right? So then it's a matter of learning the skills. And it's like, better the devil you know sort of thing. So I would say to people, if that's an option, I think that's probably one of your best courses of action, if possible.
Thanks for bringing up the interviews. Actually, that gives me a good segue into the last part of the interview where we talk about this sort of like process of writing and self-publishing and stuff like that. And so one thing you did that was really interesting was you did, I think, nearly 20 interviews with people for your book, which is a lot of work. But managing interviews and stuff is actually kind of like a whole skill set unto itself when you're doing a research project. How did you do that? Did you schedule all? I mean, let's just say it was 20. Did you schedule them all in advance? Did you record them and then do full transcripts, things like that?
They were most of them were written interviews. So
Okay.
I would email them the questions and say, if you want clarification on something, and then sometimes people would go on a little bit too much, and I only wanted, say, 100 words or something. So I would edit it so it was more concise and check, do you feel that how I've rephrased this still represents what you wanted to communicate? And I'm a little bit analog, so I have a notebook where I was writing down, like, for this chapter, interview this person, see if I can interview that person for another chapter. So yeah, it was a massive project, but like as I said earlier on in our conversation, I know for a fact that I can't offer valuable input on everything that I wanted to cover. So I had to make sure. Oh, actually, sorry. One thing also was crowdsource testing. That's another way that people can get started. And I have no experience. I know what it is. Like I know some companies that do it, but I have no experience. So I interviewed a few people who've done that, and it wasn't necessarily a case. It's not just like land your first role, but one, it gives you experience, but it's a way to upskill. And again, you've taken the initiative to do something about your desire to upskill, not just like talked and talked.
Yeah, and for people interested in crowdsource testing, I recommend get the book. You'll find out a lot about it, and it's a really interesting idea. I guess how did you know when you this, and again, this is sort of very sort of specific sort of writerly question, but how did you know when you were done?
I'm not actually done yet. I still have 2 chapters I want to write.
Oh, okay.
But in terms of done enough to release it or like charge money for it, I kind of wanted, I guess, an MVP. So something that was like complete on its own. And I asked for feedback from the reviewers saying, okay, this is what I plan to cover, this is what's going to come up next, and got some good feedback on that. I'm kind of in my mind thinking about setting a date. So I have the outlines of the next 2 chapters and expanded the bullet points, but at the moment I'm still waiting for, I don't know how to describe it, like, this is why I like written communication. I'm waiting for things to settle in my mind. So I'm coming back to it like every second day and then expanding it and coming back to it. But yeah, that's the plan. 2 more chapters and then done.
That's really interesting. One thing, again, a very specific question. One thing that people often do when they release a minimum viable product book is, and they plan to add chapters, is they'll actually sort of start out at a lower price and then kind of raise the price as time goes on and they add content. Is that something you're planning on doing?
I am planning to raise the price with new chapters. I actually have done that. I had a pre-sale on Gumroad, and then that was one price. And then I started raising it because I kind of want to thank the people who've had faith in me, especially for the people who bought the pre-sale book. But I kind of want to thank the people who had faith in me by charging a lower price.
Thank you very much for putting it that way. The way I put it sounded quite mercenary, but actually the way people think about it is like, oh, I'm going to raise the price on people as I add more content. But actually, the way everybody who does this thinks about it is actually exactly the way you put it, which is, thank you so much for buying my book, early on, is why you actually put a lower price than you think the book will have eventually when it's complete. It's sort of like you're actually lowering the price. It's not that you're raising it, is probably a better way of understanding it, and sort of rewarding people and thanking them for, coming on board on your project even before it's finished yet, and when there's still still work to be done.
Mm.
My last question that I always ask people if they're an author on LeanPub, if they're a guest on the podcast, is if there was one feature as an author that we could build for you, or if there was one terribly annoying bug or problem that we could fix for you, is there anything you can think of that you would ask us to do?
Probably write on mobile. I discovered that you can't write on mobile, so I was copy pasting from Word docs. The reason for that is I'm currently on parental leave, and I've been writing the book at night after my children have fallen asleep. And often my 2-month-old is in my arms, so I have to do it on the phone. So I guess that would be, I would have appreciated that. Word docs is a bit of a workaround.
Oh, that's really interesting because we do have the sort of write in your browser thing, but I'm gathering that's probably not remotely optimal for anything unless you maybe have a huge tablet or something like that.
Yeah, because I tried on Safari, and I guess it's a bit weird to be. I think I've written, it's not just on my mobile and copy paste from Google Docs. I'd be hunched over my son on my laptop, typing away. That's I guess it's not the normal way to go about it, but at the end of the day, I wanted to use the time that I had, and I didn't really want to try and do it when my children are awake. So it's all about the hunch posture.
Yeah, no, thanks very much for sharing with that. Those kinds of details are really important for us to kind of learn about how people do, and they're actually really kind of hard to get people sometimes to sort of share that level of detail of what they're going through and how they're trying to do things. Writing on mobile actually is quite popular for certain kinds of fiction, like for example, Wattpad. I don't know if you've heard of them, but they're really popular, where it's kind of like people just like tap out a chapter on their phone when they're on the bus or something like that for their serial fiction novel about vampire werewolves or whatever it is. That's actually, like, writing on mobile actually is something that's quite popular in some circles and something that we should definitely try and accommodate better. Well, Nicola, thank you very much for taking the time to be on the podcast and for using LeanPub as a platform for your book. We really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks. And as always, thanks to all of you for listening to this episode of the Front Matter podcast. If you like what you heard, please rate and review it wherever you found it. And if you'd like to be a LeanPub author yourself, please check out our website at leanpub.com. Thanks.